Welcome to Staying Connected, a podcast where I talk to people about their stories with VEDS, Marfan, Loeys-Dietz, and related vascular and aortic connective tissue conditions. The views, information, and opinions in this podcast are those of the individuals involved, and the information presented does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Welcome back to a new season of Staying Connected. This season, you'll hear from members of our Loeys-Dietz, vascular Ehlers-Danlos, Marfan, aortic dissection, and VUS or variant of unknown significance community about their experience with these conditions. To kick off the season, we're going to talk to Bridget Porter about her son Connor's story with Loeys-Dietz. Connor passed away from an aortic dissection at 13 years old. She'll also share with us what her and her family have been doing since he died to raise awareness and support progress for our community. Heads up, in this episode, we will talk about what happened to Connor, which may be difficult to listen to. Before we jump into the interview, if you like this podcast and want to support our community in our efforts to raise awareness through this show, you can buy merch in my Printify pop-up store or support the show by joining my Patreon. This show wouldn't be possible without the continued support of my Patreon subscribers, so if you've already been supporting the show, thank you. Let's get into the interview with Bridget. Hey, Bridget, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast to share your son Connor's story. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself before we jump in?
Sure. First, thanks so much for inviting me on. I think what you're doing is amazing, telling everyone's story. They're so important. My name is Bridget Porter, Bridget Porter Metz. My son's name is Connor Metz, and unfortunately, he passed away at age 13 from undiagnosed Loeys-Dietz, which resulted in a fatal aortic dissection.
Yeah.
So here to share our journey and our story, what led up to his dissection, the journey of trying to get diagnoses and that going undiagnosed, and then what we've done life after the loss of Connor.
Yeah.
So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining to share his story, and then, of course, your story since all of this and what you've done. I really, really appreciate it. What were some things about Connor that kind of indicated Loeys-Dietz that you think were missed early on?
So it started really with birth, right? I went in a couple of times in that 9th month with things just not being right. And then during birth, we tried natural birth or vaginal birth to no avail. So finally a C-section. And the doctor actually told me that difficult births can cause difficult babies, or difficult babies can cause difficult births. And they attributed it to him to being a difficult baby and said he wasn't smart enough to get through the birth canal. And so they attributed it to an intellectual gap. And then as time went on, he had a large head. He had some water on the brain. They call it extraaxial fluids of infancy. He didn't walk until he was 2. So we had him in PT and OT, and we were looking at these. And at age 2, approximately, he would develop on one side, we'd drag, and I would say, it's almost like he has a palsy. And the doctor, no big deal. So, well, yeah, he has cerebral palsy. So initially they thought it was cerebral palsy. And then as he got a little bit older and he started doing testing, he tested in the top 1% of the nation. So he wasn't 3/4 speed, as the doctors had told us. He was brilliant. So they were scratching their head. So we brought him in for a number of things. He had a deformation in his chest, which is called a pectus carinatum. He had this blue vein across his nose that people called an angel's kiss. And so we talked about that. They said, it's just he's fair-skinned. So he had very fair, translucent skin. His eyes, no one diagnosed this, but we know after the fact his eyes were widely set. He had double strabismus, which means his eye muscle control. So he actually had surgery at the age of about 2.5 to fix that. And so after that is when we discovered how smart he was. Before that, he was really clumsy and he was falling. And when you don't have control of your eyes, there's a lot of other things that can happen. So at age 2.5, my mom came to visit, and I'm originally from New Orleans, and she brought a king cake box, and on the side it had words like raspberry, strawberry, blueberry. He was 2.5, and he walked up and read raspberry, strawberry, blueberry. Extremely bright kid, extremely kind and soft and gentle. But he had a little bit of a blue tint to his eyes, and as you work down, he had a really narrow chin, high-pitched roof. He didn't have the bifid uvula, which many have, but that's about the only trait that he didn't have, consistent with Loeys-Dietz type 2, which is what Connor had, the TGBFR2 mutation on that gene. And as you went down, it was that pectus, which is the deformity of the chest. And then he was very hypermobile ever since infancy, hence the PTOT, and which is probably why he couldn't get through that birth canal, that floppiness, nothing to do with his intellect. And then he had his feet, he was pretty tall. When he passed away at the beginning of COVID, he was 5'4". Connor passed in December of 2020. He was about 5'10". So he had this huge growth spurt, and his feet, he had what they call Loeys-Dietz feet, is now what we know them as. But they weren't quite club feet, but they were very flat. And the structure of his feet, it was always amazed me. And I used to say, oh my God, what happens if he gets taller or gains weight? How will those feet support him? So his feet, his hypermobility, the pectus. And then as he got older, the pediatrician identified a pattern of traits and thought he could have genetic testing. So we took him to that genetics meeting. I was confused because they didn't do any testing. They did some clinical assessments and determined that he would be prone to joint pain and maybe early onset of arthritis. And then, said there's nothing to worry about. He's hypermobile. Mom's hypermobile. He's got a big head. Dad's got a big head. Sorry, Keith. And they did some tests with my hands, his hands. I'm assuming now they were ruling out Marfan. He was super hypermobile, so they ruled out VEDS. They told us that he had maybe an unspecified connective tissue disorder, but not to worry about that there was nothing we could do other than avoid high-impact sports, avoid stairs on a frequent basis, have him swim as much as possible. So we went so far as to move from a 2-story to a 1-story and a house with a pool. Didn't sit well with me because my question was, well, we came here. I flew all the way in from Asia where I was working at the time for genetic testing. Where's the test? They said, there's no need to label a child. Just take care of his joints. Told the pediatrician to monitor him closely. No definition of what that meant. So we took Connor back. He was having some backaches and things, and he was determined he had mild scoliosis. Then he was having progressively worse migraines to the point where he was throwing up. We had an MRI of the head, and they said he was dehydrated, give him more water. In hindsight, now that I know what I know from all of these wonderful foundations, Marfan Foundation, John Ritter Foundation, Loeys-Dietz Foundation, and attending conferences and those things, we know that those are all progressive signs of Loeys-Dietz. After Connor died, of course, we wanted answers. The ER doctor was the first to approach me and say, your son's really tall. I was called for pediatrics, that there was an aortic dissection. I was wondering where the child is because your son is so big. I think he has something called Marfan syndrome. Because he's 13, they're going to do an autopsy, but you need to get those results because I think your older son and your husband fit the criteria, both of them also being very tall. So my heart sank, but I was like a dog with a bone, must get test results. It turned out that the deaf worksheets were changed and any reference to unspecified, which I have the originals, and unknown were removed. and just changed a connective tissue disorder and aortic dissection so that they could bypass autopsy. So I really needed to know if the rest of my family, why did Connor dissect at 13? And was the rest of my family at risk?
Yeah.
So pause for a second. What we had to do was arm wrestle and have our funeral director refuse to pick up Connor.
Yeah.
Until they would agree to test him. So we were successful in that. We did not get an autopsy, but we got tissue testing. And 2 months later found out that Connor did not have Marfan syndrome, but he had Loeys-Dietz syndrome.
Yeah. Did that geneticist that you saw diagnose him with hypermobile EDS?
No, not officially. Their game was, even when you look back in his medical record, I had several of my friends who are doctors look at it, and I looked through all 2,000 pages except for the ER visit, too much. There was not even a formal diagnosis of cerebral palsy when I was younger, but yet I had letters of diagnosis for cerebral palsy because he was in a special school for kids with orthopedic impairment for cerebral palsy. So his, what they call problem list, the only thing on his problem list was loose ligamented. So here was this child that we'd taken in. We talked about one of us maybe leaving our job because he was such a frequent flyer for these different needs. Really had no diagnosis to speak of other than loose ligamented. It was kind of crazy. And so my doctor friends whose kids grew up with Connor was like, wow, this reads like the report, or, you know, what the ER got was in essence a healthy kid walking in there. Nothing to look for, nothing to flag them that this could be an aortic dissection, not even connective tissue disorder in the diagnosis. That was all buried in the notes, like page 7 of the notes, that when I went back and read the internal notes, because I asked, so tip to folks listening, ask for the full medical record. And even with the full medical record, there were some things missing, right? Like this letter that we happen to have on file that he had cerebral palsy, missing from his full medical record. So when we went through that, buried in there was that they thought that he had an unspecified connective tissue disorder, perhaps Ehlers-Danlos. They didn't specify hypermobility. They just called it Ehlers-Danlos. And then I think Sjögren's or yeah. So those were the two that they were suspecting. But they told me that there was no big risk. It would just be his joints and to let it play out. And so we did bring him back for 2 subsequent issues that in hindsight were definitely signs of Loeys-Dietz, but they didn't put the pieces together. Yeah. And in hindsight, his pediatrician acknowledged she had no special training on connective tissue disorders and that there were no pediatricians in Kaiser, Northern California that specialized in connective tissue disorders. There was only an adult program. So at that point, she was the most informed doctor because remember, we had an older son who was 16. So what do we do with him? For 3 months, we didn't know, does he have this thing? And they were telling us, we should put him on blood pressure meds. We should, so my son, Nick, we were able to get him over to Stanford, who does have what was really ironic and heartbreaking was A, that Connor didn't have to die, and B, one of the best facilities in the nation was 45 minutes from our home. And if we would have just gotten him to Stanford, regardless, what we found out in our debrief with Kaiser is that geneticist had never heard of Loeys-Dietz. So they did not screen him for Loeys-Dietz. So there was a reason to label my child, right? Now he's permanently labeled in granite. So when people tell you that, my biggest regret is I didn't fight harder, right?
Even though that was not, I know that you know this, but that was not on you. That was on that geneticist. And I know that we had talked before about this, the problem list not being updated and how long ago Loeys-Dietz was discovered for that geneticist to still not know about it. Do you remember what year Loeys-Dietz was discovered, and then what year?
Yeah. So to put some things in perspective, right? So I live in San Jose, California, the heart of Silicon Valley, home of Apple, home of Netflix, home of such great technology. Netflix could tell me what movie I want to watch next. It's called AI and technology. So all of this information was in Connor's chart, just not in his problem statement. And so when he passed away, the test, in hindsight, one of two simple tests would have saved his life. And based upon what we brought him to genetics for, his extreme hypomobility, the standards of care that came out in 2010 if they would have followed those 2010 standards of care, which they were not up to date, were not compliant, would have been to perform an echocardiogram. Right? The echocardiogram is a simple diagnostic test, right? That would have had a look at his aorta and determined if there was anything abnormal.
Yeah.
More than likely, they would have seen the abnormality. Then the next step would have been a genetic test. And that's when they would have found the variation on his TGBFR2 gene.
Yeah.
So that's what would have happened. So the answer we got was that it was too new. Loeys-Dietz is about 20 years old. So it was discovered in 2004, 1 year before the iPhone was invented. So when they told me that it was too new to know, this was in 2020 when Connor died, 2016 when he met with genetics, and then subsequently denied access to a physical in August of 2020 because of COVID. Mm-hmm. But yet he should have been in the high risk category to follow closely. Right. So all of those things, my response to them was, if I went into Apple with a flip phone from 20 years ago, would I get a job and think that I'm relevant? How is it that, look at what's happened in Apple since 2005 with the iPhone and all of the technology advancements. And then here we have life or death. We've got a major healthcare system that's entire promotion is about their integrated care and that they've got you, and that there was nothing in the problem statement. And then after he died, my questions were, why wouldn't you want to know why a 13-year-old died of an aortic dissection? They deem that to be natural causes, no further investigation. But yet it's a genetic condition. So you have 3 more patients. And I was told, we're not an R&D institution. So for all of you with rare conditions, it's really important, if you're going to someone that's doing population health and you're not included in their population because you've got a rare disease and you don't fit in that 80-20 rule, there's so many things that I know now that I wish I could go back. Yeah. Research institutions, they're going to want to figure out why, right? Mm-hmm. They're going to want to figure out the why. And we didn't get the why. So, and if we hadn't pushed to this day, we wouldn't know for sure why Connor died, that he had Loeys-Dietz. So we actually went through the process. Of course, the numbers are low because you're just burying them without diagnosing them. So we actually had Connor's death certificate revised to say Loeys-Dietz because we want those Loeys-Dietz cases counted, right? Yeah. Every single one of them counted. The other thing that it enabled us to do is we had a 16-year-old kid who was a dual athlete in the middle of COVID, who saw his younger brother die in the ER and then was told by multiple doctors that he probably had the same thing and he fit the profile. So 3 months later, we were able to, with Stanford's help, to Dr. David Liang. If you're in the Bay Area or California, anywhere on the West Coast, Dr. David Liang, get yourself to Dr. David Liang. He treated us with such compassion and such kindness, and he was able to definitively tell us, do not put this kid on beta blockers. He does not have the gene. He does not have Loeys-Dietz. getting back to his normal activities. And he went so far as to offer Nick an internship in his clinic so he could learn more about connective tissue disorders and why his brother died. And Nick, ironically, was interviewed yesterday because he then went and interned this summer at the University of Texas, Houston Health with Dr. Diana Milowitz, who is like a research guru for vascular connective tissue disorders and aortic genetics, right? Yeah. So such amazing doctors in this field. It's just unfortunate we didn't get to them before Connor died. So now Nick is studying biology and also trying to do the best he can to serve this community, right? The aortic community.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit about our story, probably much more than you asked me. Sorry about that. It's my nature.
No, it's great. I mean, what you shared is perfect. I think we should jump into, actually, before we jump into what you've been up to since Connor passed, do you want to share the symptoms of his aortic dissection and, like what kind of physical activities he was into, if any?
Connor his favorite activity was Scouts. So he loved Boy Scouts. So the weekend before he passed away, he'd gone kayaking with his Scout troop. He loved being part of a team. So he did play on his school's like basketball and volleyball team. But my husband would coach and limited his minutes to about 5 minutes because it was the trade-off of his joints or being involved in a team. And so he somehow would become the heart of the team. So there's a really neat story where Connor was not very coordinated. He didn't have the best gross and fine motor skills. So his team, it was his 7th grade year. They just really wanted him to score a basket. And so he was one of the tallest people on the team. So the other team didn't get the memo that Connor wasn't coordinated or a good basketball player. So they were like triple guarding him. So, it turned out to be the last game of his career and before COVID shut down. And so they called his number and my husband was like, that's not the play. And they're like, Coach, we got this, right? So they called Connor's number and they were bound and determined to get him to score. So after about probably 20 shots, and nobody has a picture of this or a video of this, he finally scored and the entire gym erupted and it was just like out of a movie. And so his friend's parents got the jersey from the school and had all of the kids sign it. And it's framed and hanging in our, what we call Connor Cove, all of his favorite books. He was an avid reader, loved Harry Potter and a lot of the sci-fi imagination books, and loved youth group. He was an altar server. So an all-around good kid, and just really, whenever there was a new person, he was the one to meet them. And so he'd been with the same kids from pre-K until 8th grade. So he was 13 when he passed away. So he'd been part of this close-knit community for 10 years. So he had a really good group of friends and community, and they're still amazing, which leads into your other question of what have we done after. And so I made this deal with God, please let the rest of my family be okay. I'll work to serve this community and try to make things better. So making good on that commitment, joined the Ritter Foundation for Aortic Health, and that was just a natural fit for me because Amy founded that organization after the death of her husband, John Ritter, also of an aortic dissection. And so it was really welcoming to know that it was a place where I could talk about death. Mm-hmm. And that's why it was founded. And so really following in Amy Yazbek's footsteps of there was nothing that we could do to bring back John Ritter, nothing we can do to bring back Connor, but how do we help other families avoid that unnecessary loss? So the Ritter Foundation is pretty amazing. They're really small, but they put most of their time, effort, and budget to two things. One is research, and they fund a lot of the research at University of Texas, Houston, because that's the John Ritter Research Program led by Dr. Milowitz. Yeah. And so a lot of times when you're doing a study for the NIH, millions of dollars, you have to have a proof of concept. And so those grants are smaller grants, $100,000, $200,000, and that gets you the seed money to be able to get you the NIH grant. So that's where we focus. And then awareness. So the Ritter Foundation a couple of years ago created a program called Aorta Advocates. So if you've been affected, you've lost someone, you've been diagnosed, there's this group of trained people, trained 2 years ago by Dr. Siddharth, Dr. Prakash, and then last year by Dr. David Liang. So some training in how to be that advocate or that to help people navigate this path. So Nick, my older son, and I were in the first class of Aorta Advocates, so we still participate in that. And then we've hosted many fundraisers. Our family was the focus family for one of the galas, and then just on what would have been Connor's 17th birthday on September 7th of this year, we hosted a birthday party for him, but Dr. Liang came in and did a demonstration of echocardiograms. We had our comedian, everyone's favorite comedian, Liam Nelson, come in. He has Marfan syndrome. So, it was great for somebody to be able to talk about and then weave in some humor. So it's a little bit light. A lot of the audience, we had around 60 people under 21. Mm. So a lot of them Connor's friends, about 40 of Connor's friends. And then we did free echocardiograms for the last 2 hours. So we did about 40 echoes and identified 2 people that needed follow-up care. So that was really important. So people got to see echo is not intrusive. It can take as little as 15 minutes, and make a big difference. And then Dr. Milowitz talked about research. And then a week and a half from now, we'll be going to New York. My husband's going to run the marathon in honor of Connor for Team Ritter. And then for the Marfan Foundation, I'm on the steering committee of the Loeys-Dietz crew, and we've hosted the Northern California Walk for them for the past 4 years. So both foundations have been amazing to us in learning more about both the syndromic side of aortic dissection, which is your VEDS, your Marfan syndrome, your Loeys-Dietz Turner syndrome, and then the what they call heritable, like John Ritter's story of aortic dissection, where there's not the physical traits, but it's knowing your family history is really important. So try to be well-rounded and know both sides of those pathways to aortic dissection.
Yeah, that's wonderful that you've been so involved and that you have such a wonderful community around you and around Connor and his legacy and just everything you've done. I know you've raised a lot of money for research as well. Was it like $75,000?
Our most recent event raised $75,000. Yeah. So every year we try as a family to raise or donate or contribute around $100,000 to the cause of some sort. So that's always been our goal since Connor passed.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned this earlier, but just want to make sure that we definitely covered it. I know that you said that Nick, your other son, was ruled out for Loeys-Dietz. Did anybody else in the family have that, or was Connor the first one in the family?
Good question. So it is genetic, right? So if you have Loeys-Dietz, you have a 50% chance of passing it on, right? So that's why at a lot of the fundraisers, they do 50-50 heads or tails, mm-hmm. right? It's 50-50. But the first person to have it, Connor was the first person to have it. So it's a little bit confusing. If it's genetic, doesn't it mean he got it from someone else? No, he was what was called de novo, meaning he was the first in our family. So what that means is you've got like 20,000 sets of DNA. I'm not a doctor, so you can fact check me. But in conception, it's like a big photocopier. And there was just and something happened. And so you can either have a misspelling or a deletion. And so in our case, I believe it was a misspelling from what I understand, and it just changed the meaning of that that gene. And so not all TGBFR2 Loeys-Dietz people are the same. Just because you hear the story of Connor, if you're a Loeys-Dietz type 2, doesn't mean you're going to die at 13. I know there's all this information about the average age being 30-something years old. I think what we're learning through these syndromes is that not only gene-specific medicine, but mutation-specific on that gene. Connor's mutation, there's this database called the MAC database that the UTH houses. And so they collect this information from all over the world. Mm-hmm. And so I happen to know that there were 9 or 10 other mutations that are exactly the same as Connor's. And all of those were very aggressive. Mm-hmm. So those were all very aggressive early age dissection cases. But there are other TGBFR2 folks that can live to 70, 80 years old. And so it's really knowing, the more you know about your mutation and the more you understand your own family's history. So I see a lot on the chat groups, anybody else out there with, blah, 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 that can really feed some fears, I would say. Yeah. So getting to the right doctor that understands the genetics, and I think the genetics is really important, and then the specific mutation of that on that gene is just so incredibly important to understand your specific case.
Yeah. And there's so much research to do in that area too, to make sure that like we know what the picture is versus like with all the, I'm sure it's about around the same area probably for Loeys-Dietz or for VEDS, we're still in the stage of like learning what all these different mutations actually do and how severe of an effect that each different kind of mutation has. There's like a lot of theory, but not a lot of like solid data out there that says, yes, this one is most severe. There's just a lot of like, I guess, theory in the VEDS world. So is it further ahead in Loeys-Dietz?
Well, when Connor was, when he was diagnosed after he died, but that was in 2020. To my knowledge, there was 4 types of Loeys-Dietz, right? Now there's 6. And so I guess one of my concerns with there being 6 types of Loeys-Dietz is, there is some tendency of type 1 and type 2 being the more aggressive types, and then some not being as aggressive. And so if you lump everything in, it's kind of connective tissue disorder is this dumpster diagnosis, kind of like cerebral palsy, and it's so broad. And so my concern is Loeys-Dietz, now that there's 6 types and they're so broad that it could become another dumpster diagnosis, because there's more and more types of Loeys-Dietz that some of them aren't all seem to be as related, right? They're not all the same gene or class of gene. And I'm not a geneticist, but that's where I think it's almost starting to confuse things even more. So that's where, based upon what I know, really knowing it's a lot of times you'll ask somebody, what type of Loeys-Dietz does your child have? I don't know, Loeys-Dietz. I think it's really important to know if it's which type, which gene, and then if you can get in touch with one of the databases to know more about that specific mutation on that gene, that specific information is going to matter. And then a lot of doctors out there have never even heard of Loeys-Dietz, much less know the difference between the 6 types of Loeys-Dietz. So I just think that the number of doctors out there that are really familiar with this, there's not a lot. So getting to one of those experts is really critical. Yeah. Really, really critical. And that's where the foundations, Marfan Foundation, Ritter Foundation, they know the doctors that are in this field. They're small but mighty crew. They, once you've met them all, they're so committed. They're very supportive of the foundations. They're very supportive of the community. Dr. David Liang is a great example of that. I wasn't even his patient. My son was his patient, but he called me for a 2-hour appointment after Connor died, after Nick was cleared, just to check in on me and see how I was doing. Supports all of our family events, had Nick as an intern. You can't get to any better doctor and human than Dr. Liang and Dr. Milowitz. I know that's our family's experience. I've heard stories about others on the East Coast, Dr. Dietz, for example, who discovered Loeys-Dietz, also being similar with his patients.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's for anybody out there listening who is perhaps in a different country or in a state where Dr. Liang, Dr. Milowitz, Dr. Dietz, like they're not there, and it's too far to travel to kind of get that information. Like, let's say hypothetically you have a diagnosis in your hand, but you don't understand what type of Loeys-Dietz you have. You don't understand your mutation. I want to give a shout out to the Marfan Foundation and the Loeys-Dietz Syndrome Foundation, because there is a help center where you can reach out and ask for that information. And a lot of times they will just take your question and send it to one of those doctors and then respond to you with the information. So if you don't know what type of Loeys-Dietz you have, what your mutation is for vascular EDS or what your mutation means for Marfan syndrome, you can type that question into the Help and Resource Center at the foundation, at the Marfan Foundation at least, and they will get back to you with an answer.
Yeah, and then that brings up genetic counselors, right? A lot of programs don't have, like we were sent to a geneticist and genetic counselor. They were both in that meeting. And so we think of geneticist as specialist. But what I didn't know then was that he was not a specialist. You know, he was a generalist in the field of genetics who probably was more familiar with things like diabetes and other things, not the aorta. Mm-hmm. And so places like Johns Hopkins and Stanford, what makes them unique is they have geneticists and genetic counselors, in particular, the genetic counselors that focus in on the aorta and cardiovascular. And so that's the other thing that, you know, sometimes I'll see people online saying, I've got this test from Invitae, but I don't know what it means because they can't get a hold of a genetic counselor. And that's where the Marfan Foundation is also really good at helping navigate, and the Ritter Foundation Aorta Advocate Program as well.
I'd like to I'm going to include links to both of those in the episode show notes. So if anybody's in need of those services or, you know, need to know where to look to get more information or become part of that program, there will be a link in the episode show notes for this episode.
That's the other thing that I would say is, you know, when I was asking for that test and we were told no need, had I known that there was a place out there called Invitae that has a genetic panel for connective tissue disorders, and you could get that run without a doctor ordering it for like $300, I would have totally paid $300 for that test. And then it will say, you know, it'll tell you that there's this deviation and that it's most associated with this condition called Loeys-Dietz. Then I could have at least gone in and said, Kaiser, what's this Loeys-Dietz thing? And does my kid have it? And what does this mean? And then maybe gotten referred to Stanford. And so Invitae is another really good tool out there for people who are not able to get to where they need to go within their own medical system.
Yeah, I know that they were recently, I think they were purchased by LabCorp, and I think that program is currently on hold, unfortunately. But it's anyone out there who is in need of that, check with Invitae, see if they do it. But there's also an organization called VEDS that will help you navigate testing if you can't get in to see a geneticist locally who is familiar with you or like familiar enough with the conditions to test for. Or like, let's say you saw a geneticist and you want a second opinion. I'm sure that they can also help you with that. I think that the other one is Genome Medical that still runs that kind of program. And then there's a company called Color that does testing for this as well. So there are other options still. And in general, I usually recommend people to Genome Medical or VEDS now, but that Invitae program was incredible. And I really, really hope they decide to bring that back, because I think there's too many people that need that kind of help.
Mm-hmm. I didn't realize that they'd put it on hold.
Yeah. I heard it's like $3,500 now or something. And yeah, I hope that changes and goes back to what it was, because it was pretty amazing for people. Before we jump into advice for other people in your shoes. I'm not sure. Did you share his symptoms of an aortic dissection? Did you want to share those?
Oh, sure. Sorry, I got off track.
No.
So it's, probably the hardest day of my life to talk about is Connor had called. He was picking his confirmation sponsor. We're Catholic and you get confirmed, and he gets nervous. And so he'd left a message for his person he'd picked, and she didn't see it until about 10 o'clock. So she called him at 10 p.m. at night. He was all nervous. He asked her. She screamed, "Yes, I would love to be your sponsor." Then after that, like a good mom, I said, "Okay, you need to go shower, right? Go get your shower." So he went and showered, and then about midnight or shortly after midnight, he woke me up and said, "Mom, my back just doesn't feel right." I was in the shower and it just doesn't feel right. But he wasn't like saying it's horribly painful. He's just like, something's just not right. So it's the middle of the pandemic. Connor didn't have the best posture. He had one of those really big beanbag chairs called a love sack, and that's what he liked to school from home in. And he was a procrastinator, so he'd been working on a paper. And so foolishly, I thought, Connor, this is just, you've been sitting in that beanbag chair all day, hunched over your computer. And he's like, "I got to go work on my paper. It's due tomorrow." And I was like, "You need to rest. I'll send your teacher a note." So I got him some Advil or something of that sort, said, "Go to bed, right? You're done with working on schoolwork. It's midnight. Go to bed." Mm-hmm. But I have to do my paper on the saints, right? And so he went to bed, and then he woke us up after 3 a.m. and said, "Now it hurts." It didn't help. It hurts worse. And then it progressed to throwing up. And so my husband thought maybe he's got food poisoning. At first he thought it was growing pains. Then he thought maybe food poisoning. So then he started, because it was the peak of COVID, December 2020, pre-vaccine. It was all over the news that the emergency rooms were 90-something% full of COVID. So we were like, do we take him into the ER? Do we wait for the clinic? So my husband got on the phone with the help desk. He was on the phone for like 2 hours, and then Connor was pacing, and I was like, just take him to the closest ER. Keith got him to the ER, got into the ER, got checked into the ER, and then he collapsed. And then after he collapsed, they couldn't revive him. And so that's when it was determined he had an aortic dissection. But it was pain between his shoulder blades that proceeded to throwing up. And so, and he's 13 years old. So the things that come to mind, and he had this tremendous growth spurt from that came to our mind were growing pains or food poisoning. He was a really picky eater, and he ate mushrooms for the first time the night before, and that's what he was throwing up. So we're like, he finally tried something new and it got him sick. He's never going to try anything new now. And so, but we were on the phone with the help desk, my husband was, for a good 2 hours. And that's where that problem statement came in, because when they check his problem statement, it says he's a loose ligamented kid. It didn't say he has a connective tissue disorder. So when my husband checked him in, I didn't get past the first page of the ER report, because it says, "Dad claims son has a connective tissue disorder." Claims, like as if, okay, we made this up, but we didn't even know which connective tissue disorder because it was unspecified. And so that being on the problem statement. So when you bring your kids in and they get a diagnosis, you have to go, well, I didn't know this. I've learned so much. You go back into the electronic medical record and you check, did they actually put it in the diagnosis? And there seems to be this lingering fear of you don't want your child labeled, or they don't want to label your child because of insurance or whatever else. But, in our experience, those labels, those diagnoses may have saved Connor's life, right? Because that geneticist didn't know any better, but we don't know. Maybe an ER doctor or a help desk person would have known, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and if you had, if he had been diagnosed properly, you would have known to look out for that kind of thing, and his aorta would have been monitored. And there's so much more, like the help desk could have done something different, could have sent you to the ER sooner. They could have had, a flag on his record that said aortic dissection risk when he got to the ER. There's just so many places where that could have changed things for Connor. And it's important.
So now after I have medical procedures or have something done, I go back and I check the notes and I check that kind of stuff. And I didn't, right? I just didn't do that. I didn't know any better. But now, like a doctor friend of mine who is an OB looked over Connor's file and she was scratching her head. She's like, the only diagnosis he has in his entire 13 years, according to his file, is loose ligamented, right?
Yeah,
and that blew my mind. And so if they just bury everything in the notes, it's not going to raise up if you're taken to the ER. They're not going to see that. They're not going to read page 7 of your doctor's notes.
Right. So do you have other advice for people who have been through what you went through, losing Connor, or other parents of kids with Loeys-Dietz?
I think, I see people come to the Loeys-Dietz family page and they'll say, oh, my child was misdiagnosed. And they think that the diagnosis is the worst information in the world to get. And I know it's got to be stunning, but it's really a gift. That diagnosis is a gift because with the diagnosis, you can get to the doctors that are qualified and then treat it. And so doesn't mean that life is going to be easy, but it at least makes it monitored and treatable. And the earlier you get things like the losartan or the blood pressure meds or the preventive things done, and the twice a year checkups and the scans, and it depends upon each diagnosis, if it's annual, if it's head to toe, if it's right. There's all these different things. So I just think that to rely upon the foundations, they really can steer you. And I know that people are like, well, don't get your healthcare from Facebook, but the Facebook groups, right? This is where Facebook for Good, those groups really can, they shouldn't be treating you or giving you medical things, but they can help steer you and navigate you to the right people who can. And that's half the battle. And so that would be my advice. And that I really try to be gentle with that group, because I know there's so many moms out there, and sharing Connor's story, I don't want to steal anyone's hope, but I really believe that Connor died because he went undiagnosed. That things would have been really different in 2016 had they say, sure, we're going to send him for an echocardiogram. Had those 2010 standards of care been followed. The standards of care were also just updated, I think, in 2024. So I would say get those standards of care, get the summary of them. If your doctors say no, use the standards of care to say they're out of compliance. And then that's the medical community, not just they like to put you in the crazy mom bucket, right? But yeah.
Yeah. Where do you find those standards of care?
They're on the foundation websites. I think the Marfan Foundation, if you go explore that, the John Ritter Foundation, both of those organizations have amazing websites. They've been really intentional, knowing that a lot of us moms, we have very busy days and we're not able to call somebody at 2 p.m. So what's great about those sites is it can be midnight and you can and they also have a lot of webinars, right? So Dr. Milowitz has done a lot, Dr. Liang, Dr. Prakash, all of those folks are very generous with their time, and they know not everybody is in Houston or Baltimore or, California, so they know that location can be limiting. So they're very good with their time of doing webinars. So, that's where you have access to these experts through those webinars.
I'll put those websites too in the episode show notes for people. Going to the medical professional side, I think that something that has come through a lot in hearing your story is, very clearly that, Connor should have been diagnosed. The problem list should have been updated. And that would have given Connor a better chance at life. Is there anything else that you want medical professionals to take away from Connor's story or know about Loeys-Dietz?
Yeah, I would just say, I think one of the things that I've heard, and it's not just my thoughts, but I really appreciate Gretchen. She's one of the genetic counselors, very active in both foundations as well, and works for Dr. Dietz. And she specializes in Loeys-Dietz in particular, is that so many kids with Loeys-Dietz, they assume hypermobility, Ehlers-Danlos, and they don't think that that's going to be fatal. There's not a risk of aortic dissection. So those parents get dismissed, or those patients get dismissed. It's just, and especially if it's a mom for whatever reason. And I just think that I wish more practitioners would listen to parents. We know our kids best. We know when something's not right. Yeah. And in my gut of guts, I mean, like my husband's whole work schedule, he had every Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, every other Wednesday off. So he did all the doctor's appointments, right? And we looked at, do one of us quit our job? So we wound up doing the au pair program so that my older son could continue in sports and we could get Connor to all of his doctor's appointments. In his younger years, he had OT and PT and all of these things. And then when that pediatrician, she kind of zeroed in, this might be something genetic. But it's interesting that she got dismissed too, right? That the geneticist, that they didn't have this zeal for getting to the bottom of it. And so that's something as a parent that I've had to really learn to deal with, that why didn't I get a second opinion? Why didn't I move out of Kaiser? And so if something doesn't feel right, switch insurance, right? In December, or when that time comes around, I ignored that voice in my head or that thing in my gut, and I can't go back and change that. But now I know, and I listen to that gut. Yeah. Somewhere in there, I knew I need a test, right? We need, but yeah.
Yeah. That's really, really important advice and takeaways, I think. And it's hard to remember, I feel like there's so many people that, once we get diagnosed or have this fight and get the answers that we need, the hindsight of like, oh, I should have done this sooner, or it's so easy to go there and take that on as the responsibility. But I think that when I was growing up, we had trust in the doctor. So if a doctor told us something, like that was it. Like, there's no need to question their experience or anything like that. It was a very top down approach to medical care. You go to a doctor, the doctor tells you. You don't come to the doctor with theories or ideas of what could be wrong, because then, you've been quote unquote Dr. Googling. And there's this intense amount of respect for the doctor and their opinion, and it's almost more difficult and that kind of mindset to seek a second opinion or doubt what a doctor has told you. And I think that changes once, in the connective tissue condition community, I've noticed it's a big difference in how medical care is perceived, because it's almost like the trust has been broken. That trust has been broken, and then it's, then it's eye-opening to realize how many doctors don't know about these conditions at all. And so, my mom asked tons of questions when I was a kid, and never once did anybody suggest that it could be genetic, right? And at some point you start feeling crazy yourself.
Yeah. And when we went in 2016, they posed it as reducing, right? A reduction in diagnosis. And diagnosis is kind of ironic because officially they didn't diagnose cerebral palsy. It wasn't in his diagnosis, but they all seemed to know that cerebral palsy was kind of what they were working off of. And they're like, yeah, we don't think he has cerebral palsy. We think it might be a connective tissue disorder, but it's just his joints. It's just going to impact his joints. Just focus on his joints. So they almost saw it as hey, he's so much better now.
Right.
He's doing great. He's in the top 1% of the nation. He's super bright. He's functional. He's walking. He's all these things. Just, have him swim as much as possible. Don't do impact sports, and don't do stairs on a daily basis. Right. So it was really kind of played down. It wasn't even we can't find what's going on. It was really just diminishing of just take care of his joints, right?
Right.
Like, what's wrong with you? Just take care of your kid's joints and be off with you, right?
Yeah.
So that's where I think that, the doctor that we saw, Loeys-Dietz, was discovered in 2004. Based upon my visual, he graduated from medical school long before 2004. And so, right, so he wasn't up to date, nor was the other geneticist in there. So if you have to do the continuing education, that's where AI is so exciting. So if I were going to talk not to the doctors, but to the healthcare, like muckety mucks, it would be invest in AI, right? That be up to date on those, the 2010 standards of care, now the 2024 standard of care, issuing that echocardiogram. Their pediatric cardiovascular guy looked at me and said, yeah, for every one kid that we scan, there are 20 negatives. So that's why we don't like to test so much, because it's a waste of time. Talking to me, a couple weeks after my son died of an aortic dissection, I would venture that those other 19 parents would have wasted that less than an hour of their time so that my kid could have lived.
Right.
And so those sorts of things where invest in more scans, right? It's not, you're not exposing them to x-rays. It's an ultrasound. It's non-invasive. It doesn't take a long time. So, and using AI, like even in the notes, right? That if Netflix can do it, right? As something as qualitative as a movie, there, with all of those boxes, I know that Gretchen and Hopkins, they do what's called a circle chart, where they take a kid from the head down to the toe and what are the traits. Connor would have popped like crazy off that. So there's got to be algorithms that can be done. And then you don't have to worry about physician training as much. Then it's just the AI flags the candidates.
Yeah.
You send them to testing, you get the results, and you get them. You don't even have to have an aortic center. You just need to have one close to you, because if Connor would have popped, we wouldn't have gotten the care we needed at Kaiser. They just don't have a program for kids, which is a whole nother, thing of mine, because it's like 1 out of every 8 kids in California has Kaiser, and there's no pediatric program for this. And they try to tell me it's so rare, Connor might be the only case. Well, I happen to know that within Stanford, half their cases in that Marfan clinic are now Loeys-Dietz cases. It's on, now that it's been discovered, it's a lot more prevalent than people realize. And so we need to have better, but if they're not going to treat it, they can at least identify it and refer it to Stanford, right down the street. So, and I know Kaiser's not the only guilty one. So that just happens to be our experience. Yeah. So sorry, not sorry, Kaiser. But I think that there just needs to be this thought process of, especially we're in the Silicon Valley, right? You would think it would be better. There's a ton of smart people. We've got to take this on. We've got to figure out how to have that technology work to identify the people that need to get to the testing and then get to the centers that can treat them. Yeah. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, it is. Right? And it doesn't even, theoretically, it doesn't even require AI. It requires a bit of programming to flag. Yeah. To flag a case.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a little bit of algorithms, programming. With the things that we can do, if you think of like an animation movie and all the programming, we can get this. Yeah, and so that's where any Silicon Valley geeks out there, that's the challenge, right? And so that's and our family is so committed. We raise money, we contribute money. Like this has to be the future. These kids shouldn't be dying. Yeah. And when you don't have a program until adulthood, it's not like cancer where you develop this at age 24, you've had it since birth. Mm-hmm. So I think the other piece is that there's got to be more attention to it in pediatrics. Like, why isn't this just a normal part of pediatric screening before puberty? Because, the connective tissue disorders, I sell packaging for a living, right? So it's very similar. Our body's a package. And so you've got the glue and you've got the pressure. So you have the pressure from what you stuff into the box and the pressure from the outside of the box, right? And then it's the pressure. And if you grow, that glue is growing and it's going to pop. And so Connor was 13, peak of puberty, grew from 5'4" to 5'10" in a short period of time, less than a year. So we know that there's high risk periods of time where kids are more prone. Kids with Loeys-Dietz can dissect as young as 8. So, maybe it's not at birth, but maybe it's put into one of these checkups, annual checkups, age 6. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's got to be a way to screen for this in the pediatric sector.
Yeah. And to let go of this idea that nobody has it, that is so rare, it's not worth screening for. That has to be let go as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I know that we're nearing the end of our time here. Do you want to share some of your favorite things about Connor before we go?
Yeah, Connor was amazing. He was just, when he went to a preschool for orthopedic impairment. And so there, I think that really shaped him because one of his best friends didn't have arms. Another one was in a wheelchair. And so he was part of this community. And then the other part of the community was all the kids who English was not their first language and they didn't speak English. So he would read and do circle time. And so he always had a lot of compassion, right? And so then he brought this to his mainstream school. And so he would get bused from one school to the other school. And so he made riding the short bus cool. So the kids would gather at recess and wait for Connor's bus and chant, "Connor, Connor." And he'd walk off the short bus for kids with disabilities like a rock star, right? And then he had these weird braces. And my older son, who was an athlete, would be like, "Why does he get those?" So nobody wants to wear braces on their feet, but he rocked them somehow, right? And so he was just somebody that took everything in stride. He didn't seem to be jealous. He was his brother's number one fan and supporter, and he loved sports, but he couldn't ever really be good at sports, right? So he knew his limitations, but he was just so open and genuine. And so I really feel like in this genetic mutation, it's so pervasive across Loeys-Dietz kids. I think they get an extra gene of kindness somewhere. He was just so kind. He was like the welcome wagon. He was... we called him the mayor of Cabrini. Cabrini is the name of his little school. And they need a shout out. That community has been so generous and so supportive of our family. They fed us. They come out to all of our events. That community has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars in honor of Connor over the last 4 years. And it's just been amazing. And a lot of that was because of who Connor was. On all of his events, we do wristbands and it says, "Be the light." And so that was Connor. He was just the light. And so everybody's kind of biased about their kids, but he was pretty special. And so that's Connor.
Yeah, be the light. I love that. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing his story and for everything that you're doing to continue to raise awareness for Loeys-Dietz and be involved in research and everything. I just think it's really incredible what you're doing and continuing to kind of exist in that space.
And then shout out to the VEDS group, because I know you're part of that crazy VEDS group, and they have adopted me at the conferences. I get invited out to all the crazy shenanigans. So thank you, VEDS community.
Yep.
So lots of fun. And so that's the other thing too, is that folks with these conditions live with a lot of invisible pain. And that was one of the other things, is Connor's tolerance for pain was higher than the average person. So I think that that's why he didn't complain so much. Even when he was dissecting, he just said, "Oh, it feels a little bit not right." Whereas my older son would have been like, "My body's falling," right? And so there's this, I think that because there's always so much going on, that maybe they downplay that pain. And so one of the things that breaks my heart is I just read something where somebody was like, "I've got Loeys-Dietz and nobody even comes to visit me anymore when I'm in the hospital." And so I think just, if I could change one thing, it would be to have more compassion and, right, understand that just because you can't see it doesn't mean that it's not there. Yeah.
Even if it's our normal, it's still not normal, right? Yeah. It's easy to normalize when you're in the hospital a lot or something. It's like, oh, well, they're used to that. And it's like, no, you never get used to that. you always need support. Thank you for.
And Connor once said that he was such a big reader because books gave him the ability to be whoever he wanted and to be able to do whatever he wanted. And I think that really struck me, that was part of, in hindsight, that was part of his Loeys-Dietz, that in these superhero books or these books that he could dream of a life without any of these things holding him back.
Yeah. That hit me in the feels. Yeah. Well, thank you again so much for coming on and sharing his story and for being so involved.
So, well, thank you. And I know I can get a little bit intense, but I'm so passionate. So thank you for my intensity.
Passion is great. Passion's what's going to move us forward. So, we have to remain passionate. Yeah. Thank you.
So, all right. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode featuring Bridget Porter sharing her son Connor's story with Loeys-Dietz. If you're ready to meet others, get involved, or need support, there are links for you in the episode show notes, as well as information on research studies for people with VEDS, Marfan, and Loeys-Dietz, including those with the VUS. If you like this show, be sure to share it on social media or give it a rating or review. You can also support the production of this podcast by joining my Patreon or by buying merch. As always, my top-tier patrons are listed in the episode show notes. In the next episode, we'll talk with Claudia Arbeles about her story with VEDS or vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. See you soon!